Welcome. Welcome to Move to Learn, the Handspring webinar for manual therapists and movement educators. Today, Wednesday, February 10th, we welcome Penelope Easten, who's the author of the forthcoming book, The Alexander Technique, 12 Fundamentals of Integrated Movement. Before we hear from Penelope and follow with her guided demonstrations from the book, let's take a look at how things work. During this webinar, you can expect approximately 45 minutes that combines discussion with presentation and guided practice. We'll follow with 15 minutes of Q&A. Our chat is on, so do say hello and tell us where you're joining from. A number of Alexander teachers all over the world are really looking forward to the publication of Penelope's book, and this will be a preview of some of the gems that she has included. It will be helpful for you to have a chair on hand for your movement practice. We welcome your questions and ask that you please submit these questions using the Q&A button on your screen. We'll aim to finish on the hour, but may continue for 10 minutes after the hour to ensure that Penelope answers as many of your questions as she can. The webinar is being recorded, and Handspring will share a link to it in a follow-up email. The webinar is also streaming live on YouTube. And we draw your attention to the disclaimer that this discussion is for informational and illustrative purposes only and is not meant to impart medical or therapeutic advice or instruction. Let's take a look now at the cover of Penelope's forthcoming book, which is awe-inspiring, I think, and shortly we will hear from Penelope how this cover came to be created. Penelope Easten was born in Wales and studied biological sciences at Cambridge University, England. She left a PhD program to train in the Alexander Technique, qualifying in 1989. After her Alexander Technique training, she studied with Miss Goldie, who was then 86, who stripped away everything that Penelope had learned and rebuilt it so that she saw the technique as it should be, as it was intended. Since then, Penelope has sought to understand the differences of her approach and the historical reasons for them. She has been teaching these differences to the Alexander profession internationally since 2014, and her booklet, My Lessons with Miss Goldie, has sold internationally. Penelope's bio is very extensive, and it gives the best color and the best shading and the best nuances of her extraordinary life when you hear it from Penelope. So Penelope, welcome. Welcome to Move to Learn.
Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yes, and greetings here from Ireland. Yes. I hear you'd like to hear the story of how we did the cover picture.
Please.
Yes, it was during the first lockdown, and of course we weren't supposed to go more than 2 kilometers from home. And I'm so lucky that my husband is the photographer. So we decided to creep out one beautiful sunny morning early and see if we could nip past the guards by going all the back roads. And we got down to the Shannon near Limerick, where there's all these lovely stepping stones in the water. And I had a lovely hour jumping from stepping stone to stepping stone. I must have done that leap 50 times before we really felt we got the shot we wanted. And yeah, it was well worth it. It was great fun to do. So,
Penelope, how does your Alexander practice, discipline, and really life-enhancing material, how did those experiences bring about the buoyancy in that photo?
Well, you'll hear about that when I talk about Jean de Massuera's work, because that's where that came from after years of chronic fatigue syndrome and really not being very buoyant. Yes, so I'll certainly talk about that. And it's so exciting to have my buoyancy back, having had twice 3 years where I actually couldn't walk hardly. So yeah, to be buoyant means so much, and anybody can have it. That's what I do think.
But would you lead us then in a guided experience so we can have some of appreciation for how that comes about?
Thank you. Yes, let's do that. So if we start sitting, and just to start with, nod your head up and down and just feel that it's a very definite sensation of muscles working when one does that. And then try side to side. And again, it's a very definite sensation. And let's isolate the joint we're using, because if you just pop your finger just into that little hollow that's under the earlobe, and you'll notice that if your fingers stay put, you're isolating that very top joint of the spine. Whereas if the fingers themselves go backwards and forwards, then you're using the other joints in the neck spine. And we really do want to just isolate that atlanto-occipital joint, the very first joint. Now, if you look out at the wall behind you or opposite you, wherever, and just let your eyes gently track down that wall, and your head will, after a while, join in and follow. And if you don't let this your finger move forwards or backwards, then you'll know you've just kept that top joint being the one that the head is articulating on. Let your eyes slide up the wall again. Lovely slow slide. And you might notice now that it's a very different sensation in the neck than when we nodded the head up and down using definite muscles. Indeed, there's almost no sensation in the neck for most people. What do you notice? And now let's come round to the sideways. And I want you to imagine there's a feather on your nose that goes out to whatever you're looking at. It's a lovely extendable feather, and it brushes what you see. And so you're just letting the feather brush across, and that's focusing your two eyes and your attention in the same point, because normally the attention is leaping ahead or it's somewhere else entirely. And so with the two eyes and the attention both on that feather, that imaginary feather, you can start really seeing what your eyes are looking at in a way we don't normally do. You might be looking at ornaments or things in your room that you've seen many, many times before. And right now, can you see them with fresh eyes? Because you're seeing the colors and you're letting your feather brush across the textures. You're maybe having that sense of almost feeling the sight of the contours of it, whether it's rough or smooth. And as I say, let it surprise you. See it as if you've never seen it before. Yes, and again, you'll notice that as the feather brushes along, the head will just gently reorganize itself. Somehow the neck reorganizes itself. There's almost no sensation in the neck, probably. And the eyes lead the head into movement. And you might notice there's a flow in this, a temporal flow, because if there's a gap between two objects, normally we might just leap with our eyes from one to another. Whereas if we brush it with the feather, we start seeing the spaces in between as well. And so we get a temporal flow, and there's also a spatial sense, because the feather is at one end brushing the object, I'm at the other end, and so also there's a whole span of the room between. So we're in full spatial awareness of the room and ourselves and the feather all together. Okay, now let's stand up in front of the chair. I'm just going to move back to my chair and take my microphone with me. And sorry, I can't see my head. And look out at the wall again opposite. So you're standing in front of your chair as if you're going to sit on it. And look out at the wall opposite you, whatever you're seeing, and imagine a ladybird. I think in the United States you call it a ladybug, a pretty little insect, and it's going to be walking down the wall. Now, you might have noticed earlier that as your eyes go down the wall and the head gently nods, you might have a lengthening sensation in your neck, particularly if you're someone who has the habit of standing perhaps with your neck a little bit pulled back, that this nodding movement actually helps to lengthen out the neck spine. And you might even feel that lengthening your back. In the Alexander work, we're very keen on lengthening. We're always looking to maintain our length. And if I should let that atlanto-occipital joint fall forwards, of course, I've shortened my spine. And if I've kinked at the waist or bent from the chest, again, I've really shortened. So I want to keep everything long. I'm going to keep that finger in the ear and just watch that ladybug walking down the wall, really letting my eyes see where it's walking. You can use your finger as well to help cue you, to remind you to stay out there if you want. And then you might notice that as the ladybird starts walking across the floor, it starts pulling your torso into a tilt. And because we're not going to use these parts of the body to bend, the next joint that is pulled into use is the hips and also the knees. Let your eyes stay with the ladybird, and as you go deeper down, you might find that this movement is becoming unfamiliar as muscles are called into play that you don't know. And so the temptation will be to draw in and investigate it. But I want you to stay out with the ladybird and trust to the unfamiliarness of it, and trust that your stool is still there, and just let the body make the bend it wants to make, staying with the ladybird, staying out of the way. The minute your backside touches down, stop, and then let the ladybird walk away from you, and you will sit back up in the chair until you come to a lovely upright sit on the chair. Now, are you sitting differently to how you usually sit? And did you let something unfamiliar happen? Did you let muscles come into play or a bend happen that you wouldn't normally make? And if so, Miss Goldie would say, you've made a discovery. You've discovered a little bit more about how your body can move. And so what we've discovered is that the eyes can lead the vision into movement, which is the eyes can lead the body into movement. I'm sorry. And if you were a small child, this is how you'd move. You wouldn't think about your hips and your knees to bend to a toy on the floor. You'd see the toy and you'd go for it. And you'd just go into a squat quite happily, led by the vision. So there's a scientist and Alexander teacher called Tim Cacciatore, and he's done some lovely research on posture, which has actually been very little researched. It's quite hard to research posture. And he calls this the dynamic modulation of postural tone. It's a wonderful phrase, meaning that the muscles are responding moment by moment to what is required of them and rebalancing the postural tone accordingly. And it's a very different image to how we've been brought up to think about muscles moving, of one muscle moving and the other muscle then passively releasing, and they take it in turns. Everything's working together in this dynamic relationship. So,
Penelope, that was a really transformative experience. And I really appreciate your the gentleness with which you guide, and also the interoceptive, how you join the interoceptive and proprioceptive senses. Would you speak about how your life experience has brought you to the study of Alexander technique, the study with Miss Goldie, and then bringing the techniques into the present?
Thank you. Yes. You heard earlier that I started a PhD, and I didn't know it, but actually I was a fish out of water. I really was in the wrong place for me. Within a year, I was on the edge of a nervous breakdown, and fortunately my back seized first. And that's what took me to my first Alexander lessons, which really saved the day, and realized very quickly this is what I wanted to do. The lessons were very quiet and undemanding and kind, which was just what I needed in that state of nervous debilitation. But this never changed. I was instructed on how to do semi-supine every day, to lie down in a particular way, how to think I can do less, to look after what was happening in the lessons. But I never got any instruction on how I could develop the work for myself, that I would always need a teacher somehow to bring about real change for me. And I was asking from the beginning, how did Alexander do this for himself? And I didn't get any answers. So I did 3 years of lessons, I did 3 years of training, and nothing really changed in that, in a sense. And that was my experience. I came out not really knowing how to work on myself. And I didn't realize that until I built a practice and had several months of working. And then my use fell apart. I couldn't cope. And I realized I needed some new input. And that's what took me to Miss Goldie. There were a lot of first generation teachers still in London at the time. I had a choice. And I chose her for various reasons. She'd been closest to Alexander, it turned out. She'd worked alongside him for 30 years. She'd housekept him towards the end. She'd looked after him as he died. And she was a dragon. She lost no time in telling me I knew nothing about the technique, which was a puzzle because I'd been in it for 6 years. My beautiful upright spine, she collapsed it because she undid the fixing in it. And then she spent months slowly rebuilding a very different integrated muscular use in me that was strong and dynamic and gentle and coordinated, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. She showed me how to come to quiet. She showed me how much I was interfering in my own process and how I needed to bring my mind out of the way, as we've just experienced. But initially, I brought to the process what I'd always brought, which was a passive use. That's what I'd learned how to do. And she challenged me on lesson 6. How many lessons have you taken with me so far? 6, Miss Goldie. I'd already heard her temper. I don't know why you bother. You have not begun to think for yourself away from here. And she just went at me all lesson. It was horrible. I was in tears. And a bit of my head thinking, I could just walk away from this. I don't need this. And another bit of my head thinking, I'm going to show the old bat. And so I went home, and before picking up my kettle, I stopped and I brought myself to quiet. And I just looked at the kettle and then brought my mind out of the way. And then I just gave consent, and my hand just moved in such a different way. And then it folded around the kettle in a way it had never done before. And then all the muscles of my body lifted with exactly the right amount of force for that kettle in that moment, because you never know how heavy a kettle is going to be when you lift it. You don't know how much water's in there. And it was so different. And in that moment, I made my first discovery about the technique. And in fact, this is the process that Alexander discovers in his 3rd book, Use of the Self, where, because he's trying to learn to speak in a new way that doesn't give him the voice problems, and he's rearranged his musculature, but every time he goes to speak, he does the old thing. And only when he discovers how to come to this complete quiet, where he completely stops reacting, is he then able to allow something totally different to happen. And so his body shows him the technique. And that's the process that Miss Goldie brought about in me in that day. But Alexander doesn't talk about relationship, because in that moment I came into relationship with my kettle. And he quite clearly was using that. I discovered that from Erica Whitaker, another of the first generation teachers. But he never writes about it, and he never particularly talked about it. He talks and writes as if he's a self-contained unit. And that's how we have tended to be, to work the technique up till now. After Alexander died, 3 main streams emerged in London that carried the technique forwards: the Barlow, the Carrington, the MacDonald stream. And they taught in very different ways, and a lot of rifts happened at that time. And a lot of wonderful work has happened since then to heal those rifts and learn from the different streams. to see if people can build back up a whole picture of the technique. But what Miss Goldie showed me is there's a whole aspect of the technique that never made it into the mainstream training. And what I've later discovered is there's other aspects that even she didn't know about. So we've been handed a marvelous technique by Alexander, but we've actually only been handed half of it, I think. And we need the other half as well. And it's beautiful stuff. So I began on a 30-year journey to discover just what Miss Goldie was doing, why it was so different, and what the science behind it might be, because it just seemed to be so clear what she was doing. There were such clear experiences. I felt there had to be good science under it. So after my lessons, I carried on working on myself with this discovery process and with my pupils. And it was in fact the only way I could work at that point, because something about the chronic fatigue and the balance of my eyes, even though I did a lot of natural vision work, there was something in the balance of my eyes and brain that when I tried to read, it actually made me physically ill. So I couldn't read anyone else's writings. Because of the chronic fatigue, I didn't have the stamina to go to workshops. So I had to work on myself. It was actually a tremendous gift. I twice had return of the chronic fatigue that laid me out for a year, as I've said. The second time was particularly bad. I was pretty well bedbound for a year, and I lost a lot of strength. And when I started to get better and actually cleared the chronic fatigue at that point, I'd lost a lot of strength, and I recuperated first with yoga and then with swimming. I still do the yoga. But I carried on using the thinking process, hoping that it would lead me back to that dynamic, springy, coordinated, strong frame that Miss Goldie brought about in me. And it never did. And after a while, I realized there was something missing. And what was it? So now with the strength to go to workshops, I did some craniosacral and learned about fascia and Thomas Myers and tensegrity. I worked with Philip Shepherd and discovered his embodiment work, with Peter Grunwald and his eye body work, which got me reading again, which was good. And then I discovered Jando Masuero. And he's a French teacher of the technique who'd been studying Alexander's books for years. Excuse me. And also asking, how did Alexander do it for himself? And what he was aware of is that if, say, you have a constricted shoulder, then in a lesson, a teacher will do a strong pull for you to pull that out. But it's always been thought we couldn't do that for ourselves. And Jando said, Alexander must have done that for himself. How did he do it? Well, he'd not only read Alexander, he'd also read Bernstein, biomechanics. He's got a physics brain that I haven't. And he'd also read Delsart, who we knew there was a Delsart link. And he was the first person able to read it in French and actually find the mosaics of clues that linked it together. And through that, he's worked out the precise pulls that Alexander must have done and the brain thinking process that he must have used to use them without interfering in his process. So I took lessons with Jando, and thank you. The first lesson felt so weird because all of you who know Alexander will know how gentle and how non-doing it is. And here he was asking me to do these strong, dynamic, powerful pulls on myself. And part of my head was going, this is wrong. But I realized he was getting me to do for myself what Miss Goldie had done for me. She using the same very different moves. And by the end of the session, I felt like I had a session from Goldie. So here was my missing link. And this is what I've used to bring back that springy, bouncy, coordinated frame that's actually left me feeling 20 or 30 years younger. I recommend it.
Penelope, would you give a little more detail to that process and that experience of embodying the youthful springiness, the quality of springiness, because that is elusive to many people.
Yes, it is.
And you have gone from having it to having less of it to bringing it back for
And
yourself.
better than ever. Yes, yes, I'll do that. Actually, is my very last exploration, if I may. So yes, thank you for that. We'll do that then. Let's have the first slide actually and look at what Alexander was trying to do and why Alexander work is different, say, to yoga or to Pilates, which is a question that's often asked. Why is it different? Is it different? Now, Alexander observed that most people stand and use themselves rather badly, as I'm demonstrating in this picture. And how do we improve the use? And he realized what we're up against, that firstly, we're up against our immense complexity. We've got 208 bones, 800 muscles. And if we start dealing with those piecemeal, we're actually going to create chaos in the system. We're going to get our knickers well in a twist. We've got to find the integrating mechanisms by which the brain will sort it out for us, because we have our own onboard computer that wants to coordinate all this. And the second thing we're up against is our habits, because habitual use feels right. And we will not knowingly engage in a use that feels wrong. The person who sits like this all the time, their body's telling us that's how to sit. So if I take the example of somebody who's got one shoulder lifted, their proprioceptive information is telling the brain about those tight muscles, but the brain is comparing it with what it was like yesterday and going, yep, that's the same as yesterday. That's spot on, that's right. And so they will experience their shoulders as level. Now, if somebody comes along and frees that out at a neurological level, they will then experience it as twisted the other way. And Alexander named this faulty sensory perception. It's such an important concept that I think has not been enough articulated, and we've got to get past that. Let's have the next slide, please. And so Alexander developed a set of precise thoughts, deliberate brain thoughts, by which he could coordinate his body and get past it for himself. Neck free, head forward and up, back lengthen and widen, knees away. But his pupils mostly couldn't do what he was asking when he just guided them because it felt wrong. And the breakthrough came, can we have the next slide, when he discovered that through his thinking and his hands, he could bring about the new use in the pupil, and having felt it, they could then learn how to keep it going for themselves. And this became the Alexander technique as we know it, which had to be delivered one-on-one with the hands on the pupil. And now with COVID, of course, a lot of teachers are discovering that they can work online. They have gone back just to using verbal directions, and they're finding they can actually do rather a lot. But if I can have the next slide, as a biologist, I find myself asking a different question. Here I am demonstrating the pull-back neck, but cats don't go around thinking, I let my neck be free. How can we cue the nervous system to release that neck for us and to give us back to what we have lost access? How do we find this integrating mechanism that animals are using all the time? And that's what we did in our guided practice. We actually let the eyes lead to let that happen. So what's the difference? Well, the brain can process information in two distinct ways. The first way is that it can reference to known facts and past events. Oh yeah, my shoulder was there, that's where it should be. Or it can reference by experiential processing in the present. Now, mostly we use the former. We work with our default settings and we stay within the realm of the known, and we block out new experience as a result. And in our exploration, we used vision to keep us in the present and take us out of interfering in our own process so that we could make a discovery process. Let's have the next slide, because how does vision neurologically link with movement? Well, there's a theory called the two visual streams theory by Goodale and Milner, which is very well established now in optometry circles. And the vision comes in through the eyes, of course, and it goes along through to the primary visual cortex, along the optical pathway to the primary visual cortex. And then it divides into two streams. And one stream comes down to the temporal lobe. And that stream gives us vision in the vision that tells us about objects in the world. So if I pick up a cup, I know it's a cup because I can remember it's a cup. And also I have associations in the temporal lobe that cups are good for drinking out of, and so on. So I know about cups. But that evolutionarily is a very late on development, that conscious thinking. It also allows us to recognize people, to know whether they're safe to greet or not, and so on. The much older way of that vision evolved for was to navigate us with our world, to coordinate us with our world. And for us, that is through this dorsal pathway up to the parietal lobe. And this is processed unconsciously, so we're not aware of it. And it goes to the posterior parietal cortex, where you've got all your sensory information and all your motor patterns in the same place. You've got your body schema that gives us that sense of the bodies that allows us to move. And then there's another pathway. There's quite a lot of visual pathways, actually. There's another pathway that goes straight from the eyes through along the optical cortex and then straight into the brain stem below the brain. And in particular, it goes into a part of the brainstem called the superior colliculus, which has topographical maps of vision and the vestibular and auditory and olfactory, proprioceptive. Everything is layered in one place. Our homeostatic drives, our touch sense, everything is in one place. It's the most complete body map of all in the brainstem. And that has to be where coordinates the body to follow the head into movement. I speculate that. We've always been told that the brain is in charge of movement, but is it? There are, have you heard of central pattern generators that are little neuronal mini circuits that are in the brainstem and the spinal cord, and they're coordinating our innate movements of walking, hopping, bouncing, and swimming, flying if we're a bird, swallowing, breathing, all those innate rhythmical movements. And I think that when we work with these more unconscious pathways of movement, when we get out of our own way, stop controlling things cortically, we're allowing these much more innate pathways to swing into action and give us an evolutionary older set of movement patterns. And so the eyes lead, following our attention, the head follows, the brainstem organizes the optimal movement patterns, no doubt networking with the posterior parietal cortex and the cerebellum and the basal ganglia and the spinal cord, because it's now known that the brain works in looping networks. Let's have the next slide. That everything is in dialogue with every other part, constant communication. And indeed, this isn't just in the nervous system. The fascia has long been known to be intimately bound with the musculature. And now it's understood that it's also in communication with the nervous system. And that's taking information and consciousness through every area of the body. It's giving a body-wide intelligence of movement response. So the whole system is a whole system of body intelligence. And what about Alexander's idea of primary control? Is that the integrating mechanism? Well, probably not. It's one integrating mechanism. If one does Tai Chi, the Dantian is the integrating mechanism. And there are many integrating mechanisms, I think, not one overall. I picture the whole thing like a democracy. Instead of the tyranny of the brain telling everything what to do, you've got a democracy like a big corporation. You've got the marketing department and the finance department and the research department, and they're all in charge of their own patch. But before they take a decision, they send emails and memos to all the other departments so that the corporation moves together as an integrated being. And that's, I think, how we work. So let's look at the 12 fundamentals that's in the title of the book. You can see they're in 4 blocks. So we've got the physical fundamentals, which is where most people think of integrated movement as happening from. You've got our balanced fascial continuity, that connection of everything to everything, which is our baseline organization, taking us right from the cells to, the skin layer. You've got kinetic chains, muscle groupings, kinematic chains, myofascial chains, call them what you like, but they're these muscle groupings that organize the body in relationship to gravity and other forces. And then nothing can move without spiral arrangements. Everything needs spirals in order to move. And when you put these 3 physical fundamentals together, you get a functional body that will morph into movement, that can make coordinated movement. But a body will not do anything without senses. Why would we move if we're not sensing anything? We need exteroception, the sense of the sight maybe of the apple, the sense of the outside world. We see the apple, but without curiosity or hunger, our interoception, why would we move towards it? So we have a drive that then moves us. We have the interoception. And without proprioception, our sense of where the body is in space, we also couldn't move. And when you put these 3 sets of sensory awarenesses together, you get spatial awareness, a unified field of awareness in the present that we move through. And then we've got the consciousness fundamentals, of which the most fundamental, I think, is the calm nervous system. Because if we're not calm, we're not embodied, we don't sense ourselves, and our integration all gets tangled up. We put tensions into things. So we need calm, from which we can find our embodiment and our embodied intelligence. And then this third one, which is the one I got from Miss Goldie particularly, mind in the brain. This idea that if we over-involve with the body, we actually tangle things up. We somehow have to separate the consciousness from the physical body. And when we put those 3 together, what we get is embodied conscious choices that give us the focus of intent. So these 3 factors that work together, we have a functional body that can morph into movement drawn by what we see and can make a focused choice of what we're moving towards. And then life draws us into movement and we get fully integrated movement in the present. So think of this like a cat who sees a mouse, and the mouse draws movement out of the cat. The cat also is aware of its hunger or its desire to play or to hunt. And so it goes into a crouch, and then it begins to stalk. And then eventually it will make the decision to spring and to catch and then to kill and so on. And so life draws us into movement. Life calls us to move. So let's come back now. Let's have the next slide. Let's come back to the physical aspect of what we did earlier and start to move towards finding that new bouncy springiness. So here's the head-neck balance, and it is the most incredible piece of biological engineering. So we've got the atlanto-occipital joints, that one we found earlier, as the pivot, the one under the ear. But the center of gravity of the head is actually not in the same place. And you can perhaps play with this. It's not just in front, so that the head wants to nod forward. If you fall asleep in the car, if you put your second fingers to sort of horizontally along your jaw, and then let your head rotate forward to that, you might find the head nods forwards quite heavily. But that's not where the center of gravity is. It's more up by the cheekbones. So it's forwards and up of that. And if you let the head nod forwards to that point, maybe using your eyes down the wall, you might notice that it puts a slight upward pull on the atlanto-occipital. So that head nodding forwards and up around that higher center of gravity actually puts a forwards and up pull on the neck, which tractions out any tension and any compression in the neck, spine, and the musculature. And that then invites the back to follow. So how can we understand this? Well, traditional anatomy is no use at all for this because it understands muscles all in bits and pieces, the biceps, moves the arm like that, and then there's a muscle that turns the neck, and the deltoid lifts the shoulder or whatever. As if somehow you add all that up and you get an integrated being. You don't, because there's no linkage in it, although it's helped us understand a lot. Let's have the next slide. I think the first idea of muscle linkages, this is Thomas Myers' picture, but he discovered Raymond Dart, who came up with a spiral line. And that came because he took Alexander lessons back in the 1930s with Irene Tasker in South Africa, one of Alexander's first teachers. And it really helped his scoliosis and that of his child. And when Irene went back to London, he thought, how can I keep this going? Now, he was a very gifted anatomist, and he discovered this linkage of spiral through the musculature. And Thomas Myers discovered Dart's spiral line, and out of it, he did a series of dissections in which he looked for the fascial linkages between muscles instead of doing what most anatomists do, which is strip out the fascia and get nice, clean individual muscles. So this line is called the superficial back line, and line may not be now the right word, because fascia works in volumes, not lines. So I'm going to talk about fascial, the continuity. So our superficial back continuity, which starts at actually at the frontal, the eyebrows, comes over the fascia of the scalp to the occiput, down the erector spinae, and down across the sacrotuberous ligament to the hamstrings, down the calf muscles, down the Achilles, and then right down the plantar fasciae to the toes. So functionally, this is one functional unit when we're standing up. The whole back line of the body is a functional unit. Let's have the next slide and look at this side on. And this is our standard image of a good posture that if you look at any Google good posture, this is the sort of image you will get. It's been long established for centuries, I guess, I don't know. But if you look at it with Alexander eyes, from an Alexander point of view, actually, that fella is slightly arching back. The head is slightly arching back on the neck. The chin is slightly raised. The neck spine is slightly constricted. The lumbar spine is constricted. And actually, the shoulder blades are behind the center of gravity. And so that whole back line, to an Alexander eye, that whole back line, the superficial back musculature, is shortened. And if we then do that, what we've just done, nodding the head forwards and up, in order to put this lengthening pull on the musculature. Can we have the next slide, please? What we get is a fully lengthened superficial back continuity, which decompresses the spine and actually brings in a very different shape. And I'm presenting in this book a new model of anatomical balance, which Alexander was doing, but he never articulated. He never talked about it explicitly. Let's have the next slide. Here's Alexander. He's on the left-hand side. And his very first training course, they were having a party. I don't know what the occasion was, but look at their lovely, elegant posture, because the slide of the skeleton I showed you might be very unfamiliar to your eyes, but this posture, I think one would agree, is elegant and beautiful. And it's much more straight up and down. The rib cage is not lifted. The lumbar spine is much more open. And the head is always, all the heads are slightly forwards of the body. The only one who's not doing it beautifully is Alexander's brother in the center, who's actually got his hips pushing forward, so don't look at him. And then if you look at the lady on the right, who's Marjorie Barstow, she's got a beautifully lengthened vertical arm and her palm facing backwards, which was Alexander's measure of a perfectly aligned torso and body. He said only when the torso is aligned do you get that alignment of the arm. And this understanding has come from Jandot's work, from looking a lot at all Alexander's pictures. The same use turns up again and again and in his students. And he calls it the unity line. And it just brings a very different balance to the body. So let's put the slides away and do a little exploration of the first elbow pull, the first pull that I did with Jando to start to bring back this much springier more dynamic use. And it's Alexander's pull to the elbow, which is a pull we've all heard of. So I want you to take, you might like to stand up for this and just, I want you to push your finger into the crux of your elbow and push it away from you so that you're sending the elbow away. And now also rotate it a bit forwards and pull it down so it doesn't pull up into the shoulder. So you've taken it outwards, forwards and down, and then see if you can imagine a string on the elbow that's getting that to do it for itself. Okay, and now let's try that on the other side. So just send your elbow away with your finger, so sending it outwards, and then bring it forwards and also downwards so it doesn't pull up into the shoulder. And again, seeing if you can do that for itself. If you know your Myers trains, you'll realize this is the deep back arm line that comes up the triceps, through the rotator cuff muscles, and through the rhomboids. So actually the whole, if you now manage to do both arms together, get both your elbow strings going, pulling those elbows outwards and yet rotating them forwards and sending them down. And rather than having the shoulders back, which we've been told is good posture, look how it tends to kink my arms. If I then bring that forwards, it's bringing the shoulders forwards, and you might also notice it's lifting that upper back up and off the lumbar spine. So it's decompressing, because that is that's compressing the spine, and this decompresses the lumbar spine so that and it opens the chest. You might, if you're finding this, keep that pull going for a moment and just being aware of how your back is breathing. Is there breath in the back? Because we tend to think of breathing as happening in the front, but actually 70% of lung tissue is in the back. And here we are opening the back of the body. So that's just a little taster of one of the pulls. We would never tend to do these pulls after discovering them. We would never tend to do them one at a time. We would always use them in several together, going in different directions, different planes, and we integrate them from the brain so that they all bring the body in an integrated way in one piece. And that then can be brought about by, I've discovered, looking with the eyes or whatever, or through the senses. And the whole thing starts to integrate together. So how did you find that, Elizabeth?
Penelope, I'm intrigued, transformed and intrigued, particularly from your last phrase when you were explaining that there would be a number of different dimensions or directions integrated. That brings us right to Michael Hall's comment/question. Michael Hall says, a few years back, I had Alexander sessions before playing squash. I recall several reflex points on my body being pressed. When I ran around the squash court, it felt as if I was gliding on roller skates. Nice experience. Is this related to aspects of your presentation?
Yes, I think gliding on roller skates, your body is just flowing into motion. It's running over the ground. So often when people run, because they've not got this springiness in the system, that we run into the ground and it becomes very hard work. And what it sounds like you're describing is you flow over the ground, you can flow to the ball and get a lovely integrated movement from what you're doing. That sounds a beautiful experience. Yes, I think that links up.
What might those, Michael Hall describes these as, he recalls several reflex points on my body being pressed. Does that resonate with your experiences with Miss Goldie or your other teachers or your own explorations?
I think we don't define reflex points in the technique, though you know, Michael's teacher might be defining things their own way, because of course all teachers find their own ways of teaching things. there are certainly points to get the body working. We used the point of the elbow just now. Miss Goldie was forever tapping me. She would tap me here and tap me here. And I don't fully understand what Michael's teacher was using, but there are certainly points that link. This is the point of Jando's work, that there are points where the anatomy makes precise linkages, and by working with those points, you're really bringing the muscle trains into play. And as I say, we use the point of the elbow for that, to access the line. One can access it through points. Whether that's what was happening in Michael's lessons, I can't say. I'd love to have a conversation with him perhaps about that, and see what he had.
You gave us an example for creating dimension or volume in the thoracic area with the quote, the elbow pulls or the elbow points and strings. Would you lead us in an example of something which would be similar or analogous for the legs, feet, hips, pelvis?
Right. Yes. I work a lot with natural breathing, actually. And again, when one uses that, the process, I used to come into quiet and just wait at the bottom of the out breath. And if you can wait and just stay with your quietness, when the in-breath does itself, it will move down the body and it will open up the volumes of the lower body and open them up into the pelvis. And if you can keep that going, you can actually take it right down into the legs. And that's something I work with a lot. It's slightly different from the Jando work. It's more, but it's a way I use for opening up the volumes, because so many people aren't in their lower body. And they are holding the lower body in a very constricted way. There are also some various Jando pulls, that Masaru pulls for, again, opening up the lower body and the legs. I won't try and go into those here because it's going to be too complicated, but there's a whole set of points on the pelvis and the legs and the feet, indeed, that one uses for that. Yes.
Yes. It's my observation that that techniques for transforming or bringing attention to proprioception that then has a transformative experience in movement, in sports or in walking. There's a real gift to be able to articulate the nonverbal experience of proprioception, to be able to bring that into language, and then yet another gift, another challenge, to be able to have that be a replicable experience.
Yes.
It's my impression that in your decades of studying and searching and listening to your own experience, that you have found and model in the Alexander technique that makes this you're able to articulate and replicate this experience for your students. Would you speak about that?
Yes, I think it's very important. One of the things I am very keen on with my students, particularly now I work more hands-off, because of course with COVID one is having to work hands-off, is getting the pupils to articulate their own process. Because, you know, somebody goes through an experience and you say, how was that? And they go, yeah, yes, what's going on? Yeah, my neck. Yes, and you know, when somebody can put that into the words for themselves, yes, my neck is lengthening and it's lengthening upwards, that gives them a link. We're linking the experience and the story. We're linking the consciousness and the unconscious together, and then we can learn how to bring that about for ourselves. And I think one of the beauties, one of the things I really am trying to do is to articulate how we can bring all the Alexander experiences that we've had done for us, how we can turn it into language and guide ourselves or somebody else through that process in a replicable way. And it's been quite amazing to discover. I don't think there's any area of the technique at this point that can't be put into language. either using the pulse or the Goldie experience and so on. And concepts like, really being clear about focus and attention and spatial awareness and choice and mind in the brain and embodiment, they're all, it's languaging it is so important. Yes, you're right there. Not just for the therapist, but also for the pupil. Yeah.
Yes. From George Porter comes the question, Penelope, does your book describe a specific program to follow in order to develop a better use of the body?
Yes, thank you, George. Hello, George. Yes, it does. It's a whole workbook in itself, and you can start at the beginning, and it's in 3 parts. So I'm suggesting that everybody does part 1, which explores the physical fundamentals with that balance of the head and so on, and the physical balance of the body, and then it explores those slightly less tangible elements like mind in the brain and embodiment and spatial awareness, because we need that as part of our understanding, and then explores the nervous system, and then goes into what I was describing with the breathing. So we really get an idea how to let the body do it for itself. And then the second part of the book goes in detail into the Jando Masuero pulls, into the Thomas Myers anatomy trains and how they link, and takes each part of the body in turn. So we look at the upper body, the lower body, the use of the arms, the more detail of the shoulder girdle, which is such a complicated zone, and how to, and the legs and standing and walking, and also how to do those key Alexander procedures of getting in and out of a chair and doing what we call a perfect monkey. Because Goldie's conception of those was so different, and there's some very different stuff in there. And there's one of my favorite bits is something called the thoracolumbar fascia, which allows the whole lower body to actually integrate with the legs. And I think that's knowledge that anyone working with the body could benefit in having. And I think it's new. So, and then the third part of the book looks at what I call the pure Miss Goldie process of how movement draws us into life, and works with that in much more detail, and then looks at the learning process, a different learning process that we can have if we work with that, and then looks at embodied speaking, and finally looks at how do we put hands on somebody, keeping all that going, and put hands on somebody as Goldie or Alexander did. So yeah, that's the whole book. There's a lot there.
Penelope, prior to taking additional comments from Michael Hall and an observation and appreciation from Pamela Buchanan in the chat, let's take a look at how to order your book, since it will be available soon, and then we'll come back to your comments. And here. So the Penelope Easton's book, The Alexander Technique, 12 Fundamentals of Integrated Movement, is available from Handspring using the code at checkout that's noted on your screen for a 25% discount. And we look forward to welcoming Neil Galloway, the author of Seeking Symmetry, who will be the webinar guest in March 10th. Now, Penelope, back to a comment made in the chat by Penelope Buchanan. I'm a retired nurse and have been wondering why doctors are having patients who are in severe respiratory distress turned in a prone position to increase the amount of oxygen that's getting into the lungs. Now I know the answer, thanks to Penelope's explanation, that 70% of breathing effort comes from the back area. Now this makes sense to me.
Yes, yes, it's so important, that isn't, for COVID people. And it's not just that we're opening out the back of the lungs, we're also in prone, you take the shoulders forwards and you take the head forwards so that you untangle the top of the lungs and you access the whole lung. So I think there's a lot in that prone position. And it's so good that they've discovered that. Yes, and it really makes a difference to people, apparently. Thanks, Pam.
Michael Hall's continuing the conversation that you and he were having through the Q&A. I know the use of the elbows plays a key part in creating springiness in Qigong. And then he says elastic recoil of the tendons. Oh, we have a lot of models working here, Michael.
Yes.
Penelope, what do you say to that?
Yes, I've done some Qigong. I don't particularly remember the elbows, but I'll take your word on that one. This elasticity is so important. I think when we lose our elasticity, that's when we feel old. You know, if we've lost our spring in the step, we feel old. The more we can regain our elasticity, the more we can have that, do quite springy and dramatic things. And that again, it comes out of length. We've got to lengthen all those muscle continuities, all those myofascial continuities, and keep the body in that fully expanded place. We've got this idea that strength comes when we contract muscles, and it's the opposite actually. When we come into the expansion, we start using eccentric contractions. We use a whole different balance of the body, which brings in actually far more power. And I've become aware there's very little work done on martial arts, and I think they're using all this stuff. They're using this dynamic modulation and this new balance of the body. And I'm very intrigued by the tie-up between what I'm doing and what martial artists are doing. It's something that intrigues me. So thank you for that.
What are your recommendations, Penelope, say for a reader of your book in terms of the frequency and duration of practice in order to transform use?
Right. Well, a little bit each day is sort of ideal, isn't it? I think, the book takes it in chapters, so one can work on each chapter. And it's not a book to read overnight. This is perhaps a 6-month, a year workbook, maybe longer. It's something to work out slowly and allow the use to change in you. But if one works away, there's guided explorations in the book. There's little videos to go with some of them, so that you really can see where something is unfamiliar. And if you just work away with each one for a while and then add the next chapter, I don't know, an hour a week will take you forwards. But the point is that once you've understood it, it's like the balance of the head. Once you've understood that the balance of the head, if you've been holding it here, should be here. Once you've got that sense of it, then you'll notice it as you're going about your day. And you can be in the shopping mall and suddenly realize, well, my head's back. Let's just let that, the eyes lead my head back into balance. And then you carry on with your shopping. And the whole idea of this work, it's, although you do a study on your own, giving it dedicated time, once you've got it, you can then keep bringing it into play in what I call the lull moments of life. When you're walking the dog or looking for the beans in the shopping market, you can play with your nose feather to find the beans, and so on. So you're incorporating it all the time into your life and bringing more consciousness into your movement and changing your habits along the way, bringing more habits of different habits of movement, but also different habits of consciousness. So it builds with you, and you don't have to be spending hours a day on it. You can spend maybe, 10, 20 minutes a day doing a little bit, and then carry on with your day and think about it as you go along. So how does that sound?
It sounds promising. It sounds hopeful, as if this could be through the guidance of your book and the wisdom of your articulating the Alexander practice. It sounds like it's possible to transform. Do you think that one could go leaping from stone to stone, like in the cover of your book, if we practice this?
I think that people vary in the speed to which springiness comes back. Sometimes I think there's almost two sorts of pupils. There's those who are, because if a pupil comes in and they're quite collapsed, there's some people you give them directions and their body just unfurls. It just needs the right instruction to learn how to maintain a springy tone. Whereas other people's bodies have consolidated into that position. And this is where the pulls come in. And sometimes one has to do those pulls for weeks and weeks before something starts undoing. For instance, I had a woman work with me who had these two fingers of her hand had been stuck together for 7 years. And I taught her a pull to the hand. And she did it every day for a fortnight. And on the 14th day, those fingers came apart. So, that's where one actually does need to put some real work in. And I've seen some extraordinary things happen with those pulls, with stuff that has been fixed for a long time and will maybe one day open out again. And that will restore the springiness in the situation, because when one is in a constricted place, the springiness isn't there. So I can't guarantee how long it will take any given person, but I do think that all the information is there, and if you apply it and put some welly into it, put some real work into it, then you can get there. And as I say, I've had 80-year-olds who couldn't balance start being able to walk in balance again and get more easily in and out of a chair. I did some remarkable work with a 90-year-old who was in a wheelchair. We got him out of the wheelchair and we got him walking again, stronger than ever before, using his walker in a whole different way, being able to get up out of a chair in 10 seconds rather than 2 minutes. And it was just remarkable what was still possible in this man who was actually so bent over when I first met him. He actually couldn't lift his head. So it's amazing what rehabilitation, I think, and this is again a real excitement for me about this work. There's a real potential for rehabilitation here. And I'm hoping that other therapists as well will pick up on this work. Because there's real power there. I'm teaching children as well. I think, children need to know how to use their bodies. We've got these immense complex frames and nobody ever gave us the instruction manual. And this book, in a sense, is an instruction manual of how to use the body and how to do it for yourself.
From Treya Martin comes, thank you very much, Penelope, for your presentation. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about first generation teachers' approaches and what you felt Alexander was teaching that the three strands perhaps didn't.
Yes, okay. Let me see if I can answer that without offending anybody. There's one of the things that intrigues me about those main three people. MacDonald, of course, had his spinal curvature problem. And what he was most interested in was going up. And he developed the clearest up force that I think probably anybody on the planet ever had. I met him when he was in his late 80s. He was completely bent over. Anybody else who was in that shape would have been on a walking frame. He wasn't. He was still standing up. He was still channeling that up. But I think it was at the expense of inhibition. One hears so there was he was very aware of the up, but that was what he focused on. That's what he took away. And he was an amazing and gifted teacher. But everybody focuses on their bit. Carrington had 2 broken hips. So he was very, very keen on getting a very free movement of the hip joint. He was the one who followed up on the spirals, on Dart's spirals, and all that work. His school teaches a much gentler, quieter, sort of more detailed working of the body than came from the MacDonald frame, which had the oppositions, was much more sort of powerful dynamic work. And my first term in my MacDonald training, I actually put half a stone of muscle on my back. So there was, but it wasn't the muscle Goldie wanted. You see, I don't think and this may be whether MacDonald had that core integration, I don't know, but my teacher who learnt from MacDonald, I don't think did. The real linkage through this, what I call the thoracolumbar fascia, wasn't there. Goldie had a different way of bending that I didn't see in those streams. Nobody taught breathing. So that's one of the things I think was missing, was this core integration. Relationship was another part. And I think the people who, you see, the women worked with the small school. Goldie, Barlow, Marjorie Barlow also, Erica Whitaker, Irene Tasker, they all worked at the small school where they were working with the children in relationship to their schoolwork. Whereas apparently MacDonald wasn't interested in that side of thing. He never was interested in the eyes, as I understand. I could be wrong there. So he missed out on that whole relationship side. Different people picked up on different bits. When I asked Goldie about it one day, she said, you know the story of the three blind men and the elephant, that everybody comes away with their bit of the elephant. And what I'm trying to do is put the whole elephant back together. So yeah, that's my understanding, which is limited, but that's my understanding. Yeah.
On that note, Penelope, have you closing comments to make? And we'll all then continue in our search for the whole elephant.
Yes, Christina's just asked about Marjorie Barstow, who of course did take more of that relationship side away with her to the United States, and she brought more of that movement in relationship to life into her work, and was the first to work hands off. So I would like to know more about Marjorie Barstow at some point. I don't know enough to comment further, but I think she did take something away that was very different to the rest of the elephant. Yeah, another very much important part of the elephant. Yes. So what more can I say? But I'd love you to know more. And I'm very excited.
When do you expect your book to be published? When will it be available?
I'm hoping March sometime. We're actually still finishing the index, and the minute the index is finished, I think we're off to press. So that's still a little bit of an unknown, but we're nearly there. So I'm hoping March will be when it comes out. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that day. Yes, I know.
As are we. Penelope, thank you very much. It's been just a pleasure, so exciting to get to know you through this process of our webinars.
Thank you. Oh yes, and thank you from, yes, I think that must be Hilary saying, yes, March is it. Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody who's been watching. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye now. Bye-bye.